Understanding AIW Team Dynamics. This presentation is all about understanding a team's dynamics. We're going to look at the yellow team and the orange team as our example. And in each case, there's one person that just seems to be driving everybody else crazy. In the case of Sharon, she just won't stop reflecting and seems to be dragging the team down. In the case of Tim, he has shut down after several attempts to get his team to keep moving and is now taken to grading papers on the side and doesn't seem engaged in AIW, even though, ironically, in the beginning, Tim was the most excited of all and had offered to go first and have his things scored. So the question is, how could you recombine these two teams and get a better dynamic on each of the new teams? The simple solution seems to swap Sharon and Tim out. But what you'll find through this short exercise is that there's a much better way of understanding an AIW team. So let's begin. There's two typical people or archetypes of people that come to an AIW team. Those who tend to prefer to work alone, and that's where they get their energy from, and those who love to work in groups, and they get their energy from talking and interacting with other people. In addition to these two home bases, there's also theory and practice. What we mean by that are people who enjoy theory tend to be reflective thinkers. Not to say that the people who enjoy practice aren't reflective, but practice people tend to want to get in there, get the job done. They're the best people to be on your committees. So let's take a look at this simple 2x2 and just think for a minute how these folks might interact on an AIW team. A1 symbolizes our solo-oriented doers. The action is most important, but they prefer to work alone. A2 are the solo-oriented thinkers. They also are very reflective people and prefer to work alone. Our group-oriented people can also be divided in these two groups. The group-oriented doers are folks who typically on a staff will want to sit on committees, they like to get the job done, and they tend to like to work with other people who get the job done. As opposed to our group-oriented thinkers that really enjoy reflecting and processing and analyzing policy or decisions or even curriculum that's being considered. Take a moment and pause this presentation and describe how each of these four areas might impact the behavior of an AIW member. Now we want to take a look and see how these four quadrants can be superimposed on this very convenient graphic organizer that a team can use to place their names in the appropriate quadrants. Above the line symbolizes those people whose orientation is more around practice. They're the go-getters and the doers right out of the gate. Below the line are those people who are the reflective thinkers. And inside the circle are our solo-oriented folks, and outside the circle are our people who prefer to work with others. Let's take a slightly closer look at what the solo-oriented people are like in an AIW learning context. Above the line, A's, or solo-oriented people, are those individuals on teams who seem to prefer to do all the heavy lifting by themselves. They often volunteer to go first. However, there's a risk that they depend too much on themselves and not enough on the reflective power of the group. One anecdote I can think of is the AIW teacher who goes to the kickoff, gets so energized, and goes back to her classroom and begins revising tasks. So at the first meeting, she volunteers to bring something, but is really dismayed when folks score it and offer feedback, because in her mind, she's already done the work ahead of time. There are also teams with individuals who think about ideas and scores or rationale. They don't speak very often unless they're asked, and they're usually the last members to actually move forward, bringing their own artifacts. In some cases, they may not be ready, or they may not be convinced of AIW's effectiveness. And they're often unable to move theory into practice until they thoroughly understand the effort will be worth the risk. So these are the folks who, of course, can work in groups and with other people, but they draw their energy from being alone. That is the home base. As opposed to the B group. These are our group-oriented people who both dwell above the line in the practice zone and below the line in the theory zone. B1. AIW teams have people who act as taskmasters. Oftentimes, if there's a disproportionate number of these people on a team, the team will proudly score 2 or 3 or 4 tasks in an hour, just rushing through any sort of deep analysis, because their primary motive is to simply get it done, and the more seems better. As opposed to B2. There are also people on teams who enjoy talking, and they talk about ideas, scores, rationale. In fact, they talk so much about everything that often they can't even seem to score more than one task in an hour. If a team has too many people that dwell in B2, it's a drag on the rest of the team, because they're never getting off the dime, never moving on to the most important piece, which is how you might go ahead and offer suggestions. So now let's go back to the yellow team. Go ahead and pause this presentation for a moment and talk with your neighbor about what the dynamics might be like in the yellow team based on what we just talked about. If you said that Sharon was the person who was actually providing the reflection for the team, you were right. Sharon's role is critical, but with so many people whose natural place is above the line, Sharon seems like a drag. And every time she goes to speak, you can only imagine that Tom, Karen, and Tina are looking at each other and rolling their eyes. And whether or not Steve and Kathy are actually still participating is another story altogether. In this case, Sharon's not actually the problem. She's helping that team. But too many people above the line will make it seem otherwise. The coach then has to compensate and come into the team and partner. Even if the coach is not naturally a group-oriented processor, the coach will intentionally slow the team down, way down, and try and get the level of analysis deeper. What might the group dynamics be like on this orange team? Pause the presentation and talk to your neighbors about this situation. You guessed it. Tim is actually the one person on the team that can keep the ball rolling. But Susan, Dan, and Tracy are having so much fun listening to the sounds of their own voices, talking to each other and hashing things out, that Tim will, if he hasn't already, shut down and just stop trying to get the team to move forward. Lisa seems to be both on the edge of being more of a group person, but she also likes to work alone. Whereas Cora is probably doing some deep thinking about the things that Susan, Dan, and Tracy are saying, but probably doesn't have to ever talk because they're doing all the talking and processing without her. The coach in this case is going to have to go way above the line, outside the circle, in order to provide a voice of timekeeper and facilitator, moving the group forward and trying to keep them moving ahead. Now we go back to our yellow team and our orange team and put them both on this map. Turn to your partner and talk about how you might recombine these two teams to get a better dynamic on each one. Pause the tape here or move to this next slide where you can look at the recalibration of both team members in our 2x2 that we originally started with. This is one possibility. There's a lot of different ways that these teams could be recombined, but pause the presentation and talk what the advantages might be for this team when you've taken half of the yellow team members and half of the orange team members and put them together. Now we have the other half of the group. Talk about what the advantages might be for this new team with its members. Pause the tape and turn to your partner. Now it's your turn. Consider what your team dynamic is. This exercise is best done with people doing it independently and speaking for oneself. Don't be confused by the fact that we can all lie in each quadrant. It is true, but we each also have a home base that's most comfortable for us when we're in an AIW scoring context. I hope this presentation helps solve your team dynamic.